Hello and welcome. I want to talk in this video about male anger, how it's expressed and where it comes from, and also give voice to the crucifix that men carry on their backs, male shame. Facing anger head on, it's terrifying to most people, and they see it as something they need to cleanse from their system, instead of seeing it for what it is, a necessary and vital tool in situational awareness and in identifying threats, because anger is your internal guide. But in today's world, if a male gets angry, it's used against him. He's singled out, he's portrayed as a threat. And if he doesn't get angry, he's stepped on. And the recurring message is that aggression is a uniquely and solely male trait, and that any violence perpetrated by a female against a male, it's deserving. And it was caused by males, either directly or indirectly. And male assertiveness, it's seen as a threat, and that male will be viewed as non-compliant. He's going against cultural or corporate or societal norms. Yet if we look at it, everything is done to provoke anger in males. Boys are given no guidance on how to manage anger. All they're given is blaming and shaming. And there is no understanding for a male who exhibits anger, regardless of whether that male was provoked or has a history of abuse. And past abuse or provocation, it's not an excuse for violence. I don't condone violence, but if you condition a dog to fight, you condition it through abuse, through neglect. You can't expect that dog to respond in any other way. And yes, humans have a higher consciousness, but how many people are aware of their primal instincts and their drives? Not many. And you can't change what you don't identify. And anger management, it's useless unless the core issues are addressed. And to do that, it means a man needs to change his perception of masculinity, which means men opening themselves up to more attacks, more shaming. And the anger workshops I've participated in and helped facilitate, how these men were raised and treated. These men experienced extreme abuse, and the expectation that these men should be able to process anger appropriately, while a raging female gets a pass and is called a victim, it's not realistic. Now, you take an animal and you beat it, you rape it, you degrade it, you starve it, you shame it, you mock it. That animal is either going to lay down and die or it's going to bite back. Now, you take away a man's sense of self, his self-belief and his esteem, and you replace it with shame. At the same time forcing an identity stereotype on him, that if he deviates from, he will be further shamed and attacked. And even if he does comply to that stereotype, he's living in a society where everything deemed masculine is now a weapon to be used against males, to shame and marginalize them. See, this is the matrix that men are caught in. And the only methods that can work to address anger in men, they need to first acknowledge male pain and the male experience. They need to do that before men can heal. And psychology, it's ineffective in treating males, because it doesn't address the core issues, and I doubt it ever will. And the men that I've dealt with, they are extreme cases. And the brutality they suffered through, their place in society, on the bottom rung, they're all extreme examples. But the changes I've seen in such damaged men, and how that change has in turn affected and influenced so many others, it's demonstrated that at a grassroots level, men can improve their quality of life, and find meaning, and experience contentment. There's that line in Fight Club. Self-improvement is masturbation. Self-destruction, that's the answer. And it's much easier. And it's so much easier to destroy yourself, to act out or self-harm, to lose yourself in grief and shame and self-hatred. And we all face that fork in the road at some point. And you can walk around with a chip on your shoulder, thinking the world owes you something. Or you can just flagellate yourself with an imaginary whip. Via Dolorosa, you walk the path and you bleed it out. And I've been there. And it got to the point when I was younger when I couldn't even formulate sentences. It was like I was chewing on my own anger. My self-esteem, it was non-existent. And, I still acted out. I puffed my chest out, I put on the front, but, if there was no one there to hit, I'd hit the wall, or I'd hit myself, figuratively and literally. And if there were no enemies in sight, I created them. I instigated conflict. And as a boy merging into civilized society, I didn't have the tools necessary to make that transition. And I made mistakes, and I paid for them. But I also lost out on so much in terms of self-growth and interaction. Of course, I still interacted, but I tumbled through those years. And literally, it was like an animal coming out of the wild trying to attend a tea party. And that's the experience for many young men. No awareness, only urges and confusion. We don't equip young men, we break them down. And we never build them back up, nor do we give them tools to actually do so. And in terms of studying violence, in an effort to understand it, we tend to make early abuse a scapegoat, to explain or justify acting out. But in doing this, we ignore other pressures, other methods that have been employed against males that leave them with no other means to express themselves. And I was one of those boys, just one of many, with no release valve. And all there was a core of boiling rage ready to explode. Now, you place rats in an enclosed environment, you up the temperature, you heat the floors, you watch them turn on one another. And it's no different with humans. And you make the environment so inhospitable, and we will turn on each other and attack. It's inevitable. And self-destruction, it's often the more attractive and socially acceptable option for a man, as opposed to self-empowerment. And a man on a downward trajectory, a man who's acting out and self-harming, he's seen as collateral damage, and his presence is resented. And there's no empathy for him. But strangely, he's more accepted than a self-aware man, a man going his own way. Though it's not strange, we all know the reasons why, but a man who is self-destructing. He's in his little box, and it's only one less viable male off the market. So it's viewed as a good thing, a natural culling, weeding the weaker males out. And it also helps social cohesion. People rally around, they close ranks, ostracizing the weaker male. And it defines these people's own social ranking, and it helps them define their own identity. And they know where they stand now. And they feel empowered by looking down on the one who it's socially acceptable to discriminate against. It's identity by proxy. And there's a Japanese saying, "The nail that sticks out shall be hammered down." And a structure, it's dependent on all the nails staying put. And when nails start sticking out, the entire structure is at risk of collapsing. And those nails sticking out, they're most at risk from the hammer. And you can state that change can never happen, but the more nails who rise out of their holes, the more they change the shape and the integrity of that structure. So change can occur. But if you go against the grain, you threaten the identity of others, and this causes very deep resentment. And we've seen this, how this has affected others recently, with the recent doxing of Barbarossa and Stardust. And the people doing this, they feel no empathy. And there's no regret on their part, as it's their way of preserving their own identity. They feel justified. And any backlash simply justifies their self-belief even more. They've identified the enemy, and it's you. And this stems from an inner belief system tied to perception of identity, but the battle lines have been drawn. The threat has been identified, and as always, it's men hurting and acting out against other men. Again, all by proxy on behalf of females, whether they want to accept it or not. A woman doesn't even have to be present, and still, men act out on their behalf. But what drives this resentment? What creates anger? When it comes to the genesis of anger, and also shame and guilt and ongoing cycles of abuse, we often just give generalizations and lip service to these issues. It's often the Dr. Phil or the Oprah approach, but it's much more involved than that. And if we look at early attachments, our early experiences, they play a very heavy role in forming our perception, our behaviors, our responses, our thoughts. Many relationships today, they're very dysfunctional. And there's reasons why people gravitate to abusive relationships, which I'll touch on, but ideally in a supportive environment, a child learns how to regulate emotions. And those who don't, they often act out, in turn eliciting negative responses from others. And they're viewed as just another problem child. They can't adjust to any setting. They're often picked on or singled out. They're ostracized. And sometimes they lash out. And school shootings, they're very extreme examples. But generally, they just turn inwards. They become socially isolated. And if they engage in criminal behavior, it's gradual, but it escalates. And of course, they feel righteous in their actions as they're simply striking back at a society that shuns them. But today's culture, it's all about assuming victim status and blaming others. But the way to get back control is to foster self-regulating behaviors. And it's about taking accountability. But what do? Instead, we just look the other way. Or we just point the stick of blame at boys, further shunning them. And men are their own harshest critics. And men today, they're conditioned to feel shame for every action, every thought, every mistake or misstep or rejection. However real or perceived, it reinforces this inner belief. And this pressure that males place on themselves in every aspect of life, it's crushing. So with every interaction, this internalized sense of shame, it governs a man's responses. And the shame he feels in that moment will be in turn compounded by past experiences. And a man who is ashamed of himself, he's not going to want to look deeper or be in any way self-reflective. It's too painful. So it's easier to just throw back another beer and watch the game and blame everyone else or just self-medicate. It makes personal growth impossible. And men, they don't feel deserving of empathy. They don't feel deserving of it. Because men see empathy as condescending anyway. And there's no need for others to tell him he's weak. That dialogue is running in his own head 24/7. And with real compassion, there shouldn't be any room for judgment or for dictating behavior. It should be about understanding. But how often do people do this towards males? If a boy doesn't experience compassion or affection, the isolation he'll experience will be profound. And it'll be a chasm he may never be able to fill, without years of actually working through it and doing some incredibly painful introspection. But with the pressure on men to conform, the likelihood of that happening is very remote. And you can't feel compassion or empathy for yourself or for others when you're wrestling with shame or anger or pain. And this sets in motion a self-defeating cycle. A man can't connect with anyone in a real way. He can't experience closeness. And he perceives anyone extending their hand as a threat. Or if it's a female, he doesn't deem himself worthy of her affections, and he'll self-sabotage. And I can't blame men for having this reaction. You can't expect compassion from a man who has never been shown any. So what do you have? You have a young boy or an adult male alone in the world, and no one has their back. They're shunned and they're damaged. They're ready to strike back or self-harm or supplicate whenever they feel their identity is under threat. And I've heard horrific stories of violence from men, where they acted out, and in a moment they ruined their lives and the lives of many others. And all this was a build-up of experience and messages that were never addressed or identified. Because no man wakes up one morning and suddenly decides to cave another man's head in with a hammer, or stab him through the eye with a screwdriver, or take to someone with a blowtorch. And so much of what we do, it's about connecting. Connecting via touch, speech, behaviours. And it's no different when someone acts out violently. And that person, dependent on their history, they want you to experience their pain. And this is the flip side to compassion, but it's the same animal. Now you add in social and gender expectations as stereotypes, and it's easier to see why we need to understand the male experience. I mean, if a man suffers from shame, if he's ashamed of who he is, the front he presents to the world, it won't be genuine. And all he's driven to do instinctually is protect himself. And no one is allowed to get too close. And the brain itself, it becomes conditioned to respond, with rage, with violence. And this anger is what happens every time these men face a setback or a rejection. And they face a lifetime of beliefs and messages. It's an echo chamber. It's an echo chamber inside a pressure cooker. And young boys, I mean, if they're deprived of a loving parental connection, they may create or project an image of one in its place, especially if they're living in an abusive or a neglectful environment. And this creates a deep need to find that elusive mother figure, literally in every female, to feed that hunger for validation and compassion. Many men, they see women as their saviour, but all they find is the same lack of empathy and hurtful messages, just amplified, intensified. It's really shocking how deprived males are growing up. And to understand the male mindset and the male experience is to understand isolation, abuse, deprivation, and a very real sense of loss. I mean, I have a neighbour, my next door neighbour, his name's Ivan. And every so often his wife gets drunk, and she stands on the porch outside their home and yells at him in the middle of the night. And Ivan never goes outside during her rages, because Ivan is a broken man. And when I see him, I often have the urge to slap him senseless, beat him up and down the street, because it angers me to see a broken man. And this stems from how I grew up, because the measure of a man when I was a kid was if you could take a kicking and come back for more. And that was how males in my environment deemed masculinity. But I've talked to Ivan now and then. I try to bolster his self-esteem. I try to point out a few things to him. Ivan's an intelligent man, but he's broken. And he's never experienced freedom. His whole life he's lived in a box. And if he felt anger, it would just funnel itself into more shame, into more self-loathing. In his jail, it's a self-imposed one. And anger from an evolutionary perspective, it's a very effective tool. I mean, you can't protect yourself or your loved ones without experiencing anger. But myself, like other men, we found it difficult to regulate anger. And you can find yourself responding with extreme anger or violence to a perceived slight or a minor transgression in places such as the classroom or in the work environment. And one moment of anger can be catastrophic on a career or an education. And kids that grow up in a violent home, they become desensitized to violence and to rage. And children being children, they copy behavior. They'll act out violently, or they'll close off. They'll fight, or they'll just play dead. And children in this environment, they suffer from a whole raft of health issues, from stunted brain development, from health conditions, and so on. And so many men grow up with chronic low self-esteem, and their entire identity, their sense of purpose, it's based on external validation, primarily from females. And in a relationship, and you've seen this, they'll become doormats. doing anything to please, or become resentful when their partner isn't showering them with affection, which affirms for them that they're not worthy of affection. So they're stuck in limbo, feeling anger, resentment, and idealism towards their partner. And it's common for men with low self-esteem to choose women who exhibit the same traits their mother did, the same person who denied them affection. These men, they are terrified of failing, of being judged. So they look to the female for guidance. And we've all seen men like this. And it turns my stomach when I see it. And these same men, they can't give voice to their needs. They're too scared they'll be rejected or judged. They just let their anger boil over, or they close off even more, which makes any introspection impossible. And growing up, they didn't formulate social skills. They don't speak the language of interaction, so other kids single them out. So what happens? They avoid socializing, they underachieve, they have no focus. They can't maintain friendships or relationships. And there's so many boys and men that suffer through this. And classrooms are littered with them, the forgotten ones. And other men, they use sex to gain approval, a mother's approval. And these men, they bend over backwards and compromise their integrity in a very sad attempt to fit in. Or they work long hours, their identity and their self-value dependent on that job. And without external validation, all there is depression and self-hatred. So, the answer to helping males process experiences and trauma, it needs to be comprehensive. There's no quick fix for men. And on some level, we're all aware of that, but we repel the idea. And forgiveness. Forgiveness, it's a hard thing to come by. Forgiving someone, it doesn't undo the wrong, but it can bring peace and closure. And I've seen the end result of this from victor-offender mediations. Of course, I've seen them go the other way too. The offender self-justifying their actions or just claiming victim status. But forgiveness isn't given, and it can't be taken. It has to be earned, on all sides. On the part of the perpetrator and on the one who's been wronged. And also in forgiving yourself. And this is why the online sphere or the manosphere is so important. Because this is the only place where the male experience is being discussed openly. And the sharing of information. This is where the inner work begins. Because here is an opportunity for men to identify what drives them, and what restricts them, to gain self-awareness, and find a way out of the darkness, out of the isolation, out of the pain. But to do that man has to identify what drives him, what has shaped him, and actively work through it, and then make restitution, and most of all, forgive himself.